We're going to examine some psycho-spiritual dynamics related to all of these weather events. But before we get to that, we're going to talk a little bit about these dynamics related to weather change and some of the paradigms that are out there, some of the rhetoric that is out there about weather change. There are a number of individuals that talk about changes in the weather as if they are real experts on this change. There are all sorts of theories about weather changing. There are all sorts of theories or assertions about what we as human beings need to do in order to stop the weather from changing. Now, common sense dictates that weather is supposed to change. And so you should be formulating questions about why are we human beings trying to stop the weather from changing. But there appears to be a little bit more going on with this whole dynamic of weather change than meets the eye. And so there is a hidden or an occult or a latent meaning that goes along with this whole idea of the climate altering. And so we're going to look at what else is going on when individuals are talking about the alterations in what we call climate. In looking at some of the psycho-spiritual dynamics related to these extreme or atypical weather events, another dynamic presented itself. And so what appears to be going on is a form of gaslighting. And this is an extreme form of gaslighting because it appears to incorporate the majority of people on the earth. And so there seems to be some sort of cognitive manipulation going on related to these alterations in weather. And so essentially, we are being told one narrative about this weather alteration that may not be consistent with what is actually going on. So, the reality of the situation. Now, because I am not an expert on weather or alterations in weather, I have not been completely aware of what was going on. And so when individuals would pontificate about the weather changing, when they would offer all of these theories about what we need to do as human beings to stop the weather from changing, some of this went unquestioned because, again, I am not an expert on weather. And neither are these individuals by and large. You hear a number of individuals who are not even scientists giving all of these theories about the weather and the weather changing and why we as human beings are somehow responsible for the weather changing. But what has been occurring apparently is that dynamic of gaslighting, is that manipulation that goes along with psychopathic functioning. And so it appears that there's a psychopath somewhere in the mix because you don't tend to have these dynamics without a psychopath being in the mix. Now, some people like to use the term narcissist, but when we're going into this arena with the significant gaslighting and the manipulation, what we are talking about is psychopathy, not simple narcissism. And so not only do we have individuals who appear to be manipulating related to this weather alteration, we have other individuals who wittingly or unwittingly serve as what are known as flying monkeys. And so they sort of take up the charge and go forward with the mandate of convincing people about the weather alterations and the reasons for the weather alterations and the responsibility of humanity for the weather alterations and what humanity needs to do in order to stop the weather alterations. But what they are not telling us is what is the underlying meaning of the alteration in the climate. Some of us believe that we know what is meant, but do we? And so when looking at the psychospiritual dynamics that appear to be related to some of these bizarre weather events, we find that there might be something else going on with respect to this construct of climate that we have not been addressing. And perhaps part of the reason why there has been so much conflict about the climate and so much discrepancy about the climate and so much misinformation and disinformation about the climate is because there has been misinformation and disinformation about the basic construct that we are discussing. So, what we've been discussing collectively on Earth is this idea of alterations in climate. And when we are talking about alterations in climate, by and large, the average person is talking about this weather dynamic, temperatures. That's what most people are talking about. You even hear the construct of warming, which of course insinuates that we are talking about temperature. We are talking about weather. But what has been revealed is that that's not the original meaning for this idea of climate. And so there's something else going on. There's another discussion that's going on under the discussion that regular folks are having about the climate. And so, as you can see here, when looking at the etymology of this whole idea of alteration in climate, we have this 1983 understanding of this construct of climate and alteration or change. And so, what we see here is in the modern idea of human caused global warming, this is something from 1983. So, it's sort of a new thing. And then there's another construct that came into use in 1975. And so these are relatively new constructs. So this is a relatively new idea. Now, of course, it shouldn't be a relatively new idea because, in terms of the way we tend to think about climate, we tend to think about climate in terms of weather. And most of us experience weather that changes. It may change from day to day, it may change from season to season, it may change based upon your location. But we tend to expect the weather to change. And so it's very interesting that there's all of this energy focused on the weather changing. And what's even more interesting is how many people have gotten in an uproar over the weather changing, as if weather changing is some sort of unusual dynamic that we shouldn't expect. And so it's very odd how individuals pick up certain things and run with it when things are going the way they are supposed to go, but people have been convinced that things are not going the way that they are supposed to go. And that's what we are seeing with these discussions about the weather changing. And so what we see here in Oxford Languages is that climate, according to this, is the weather conditions prevailing in an area in general or over a long period. Okay, so that's what most of us, many of us, are used to thinking about when we think about climate. And so it says it's similar to weather pattern, weather conditions, weather, atmospheric conditions. And so that all sounds familiar to us. However, what has been noted is that climate also relates to this idea of a region, an area, a zone, a country, a place. Also, and we might not think about this that much, we think about it now because we're in the election season. However, it also relates to this idea of a prevailing trend in terms of public opinion. And so, the climate. But generally, when people are talking about it nowadays, what we are talking about are these things related to the weather altering. We are not generally talking about regions of the earth. We are not talking about zones. We are not talking about countries or areas. We are talking specifically about the weather, and for some people, specifically about the weather getting warmer, and people getting very upset about the weather getting warmer and the implications of the weather getting warmer. What's also interesting is when many people are talking about these weather alterations, some people talk about these weather alterations as if they are things that humanity deserves, sort of a punishment for humanity being bad to the earth, being bad in terms of stewards of the earth. And so some of these extreme weather events are couched in terms of sort of a payback to humanity, a curse on humanity, a tribulation that humanity needs to suffer, a punishment, a divine punishment that is occurring with humanity for a variety of reasons. Some individuals will talk about this is the earth groaning, or this is the earth giving a payback, and sort of almost deifying earth. But there is this sense of this wrong occurring, this climate change occurring because of bad behavior on the part of humans collectively. It's a very odd dynamic, but it goes along with the rest of the gaslighting paradigm about who is responsible for these alterations in the climate. And so what we see here when looking at the a part of the root of this whole idea of climate is climb. And what we see, CLIME, we see climb, it's coming out of the Latin clima, which means zone. No, it doesn't mean temperature. It doesn't mean weather. It means zone. And so when you look at it that way, you have to ask the question, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about zone changing? When we talk about regional changing? Because clearly there is something underlying this whole idea of climate that we are not actually entertaining in our general conversations. And so what we see here with respect to this etymology, this climb even, is coming from the 1540s, meaning a tract or region of the earth. And so it's a shortening of the word or the construct climate. And so it's also referring to an old abandoned sense of horizontal region of the earth. This brings up a lot of questions about the shape of the earth. There are some things that come up that are in direct contravention of our basic constructs about the shape of the earth. So when individuals talk about north and south and east and west, that doesn't really go along with the whole idea of a ball. It goes along with this other construct that people are talking about, that flat construct. It's very difficult to get an east, west, north, and south when you are talking about a ball. It's, however, very easy to get a direction of north, south, east, and west when you are talking about something flat. However, when those individuals start talking about the earth perhaps not being round, you have other individuals that will really jump on them about this as if they are making no sense. They are not considering the possibility that what we are talking about in terms of those directions make no sense, quite frankly. Okay, so what we have here is this whole idea of climate being related to space, a particular place, a particular geographic region of the earth. It's really fascinating how people have turned this whole climate discussion into a political one. And you have individuals that are taking all sorts of sides related to the climate. And I offer to you that the majority of these people that are taking sides, regardless of what side we are talking about, the majority of those people have no clue about the foundation of this construct and what actually seems like an underlying construct that we are not actually discussing. I don't believe that most of them have a clue as to what they are talking about, even when they are talking about climate alteration, as in weather alteration. Many people are simply, as we do as humans, we are often just simply taking up what we've been given, running with it, because we have been indoctrinated to simply accept what an authoritative voice tells us to accept. And then we are so bold in our indoctrination that we often then insist that others believe the same thing that we believe. And so, in many ways, you see a number of dynamics that are related to politics, a lot of dynamics related to science being treated just like religion. And so, you see people who go around pontificating about their science theories. They pontificate about their weather theories. They have a position related to politics, and if you don't believe it, you are the problem. You are, according to them, going to Hades. Okay, and so it's very interesting that this works out this way. Apparently, there is an extreme need that human beings have, that many human beings have, to have other people validate them by agreeing with them. And a failure to agree with them feels like an invalidation. And so this is the same thing that happens with religion. This happens again with science, and it happens with politics. And many people don't recognize that this is what's going on. They can see it with religion, but they cannot see it with respect to politics. They cannot see it with respect to science. But the same dynamic is going on. And so apparently many people feel alone if they don't have other people agreeing with them, or what we call co-signing on whatever it is that they believe. And so here we see this additional discussion related to climate as a noun. And we see that this is coming from the late 14th century. And it indicates here, horizontal zone of the Earth's surface measured by lines parallel to the equator. What is that about? Surely you've heard of degrees, and you've heard of these parallels related to degrees. What's fascinating is that we had individuals in earlier points in history actually offering very specific measurements related to degrees. It's unclear how they came to these conclusions, because there did not appear to be science available at that time for them to do this, but they seem to be very proficient at it. And so it goes on to indicate that the Old French had the construct climate, region, part of the earth. And then there's another interesting notation, that this region that we are talking about, with respect to the earth being a ball now, perhaps, there's an indication that climate is related to the slope of the earth. And so climate, not about weather, but about the incline, the inclination, the slope of the earth. The slope of the earth from the equator to pole. In other words, the leaning. Now, at this point, individuals should be asking, how did we get from slope of the earth, region of the earth, leaning of the earth, to simple weather? How did that happen exactly? And when we are talking about climate and altering climate, and other people are talking about climate and altering climate, are we all on the same page? Are we talking about weather and other people are actually talking about this very esoteric dynamic of horizontal lines and parallels and inclinations and slopes? Are some individuals talking about that while we are simply talking about weather? And if we are talking about different things, how do we get on the same page and why are we not perhaps on the same page? What's the benefit of having two conversations going on and having individuals perhaps believe that we are all having the same conversation? Now, again, when looking at some of the psychospiritual dynamics that are related to some of these odd weather dynamics, a number of things came up related to, of course, scripture. No one should be surprised. So it also indicates here that ancient geographers divided the earth into zones based upon the angle of sun on the slope of the earth's surface and the length of daylight. What's interesting is these things are mentioned time and time again in scripture. And there are indications that there are supernatural, spiritual dynamics related to these dynamics related to the sun and the moon and the stars and the length of daylight. And so it also indicates that this is related to the Arctic, and it's also related to change of climate taking place as one goes north, or as the sun is moving, or the angle of the sun, the relationship between the sun and the earth. And so this is not exactly what we've been talking about when we've been talking about the climate altering. And so it goes on to indicate that change of temperature gradually came to be considered more important. And by the late 14th century, the word was being used in the sense of a distinct region of the Earth's surface considered with respect to weather. That's not the same as the climate or the weather itself changing. This is about a combination of factors. The Earth's surface and a distinct region of the Earth's surface with respect to weather. That's not what regular folks are talking about when they are debating about the climate altering. It also indicates here the sense shift to combined results of weather associated with a region, characteristic condition of a country or region with reference to the variation of heat, cold, rainfall, wind, etc. And what's even more interesting is there is another dynamic related to climate that revolves around a mental or moral atmosphere. And so we use that construct also. And that also might be underlying what we are really talking about without talking about it. But what we have been focused on the surface, the manifest discussion has been about the temperature changing, particularly the temperature getting warmer. And consistent with what we see in scripture or in the Bible, we see this whole idea of incline, this idea of bending or bowing down. Actually, that's a theme in scripture, not just related to the earth, but there are discussions about slopes and inclines related to the earth in scripture. But then there's also a focus on submission and bending and bowing and diverting. And so we see here that again, there's something else going on with respect to this climate discussion. And it might be helpful if we were all on the same page again about what exactly we are talking about. Now, when looking at the relationship between sloping and weather, we find that there actually is a relationship. And so they are not one and the same, but one appears to impact the other. And so what we see here is that there is this discussion by Professor Stephen Nelson, Tulane University, wherein this individual talks about slope stability, triggering events, and mass movement hazards. This is not what we are generally talking about when we are talking about the climate altering. And so there's something deeper going on with respect to this climate altering dynamic. Now, this scientist offers a very interesting discussion about factors that influence slope stability. And so if slope is about climate, then stability would be the opposite of change. And so it would seem that what individuals might be talking about is stopping slope change. And so a focus appears to be, if we look at it based upon that construct, not a focus on slope change, but a focus on slope stability. So climate stability. Now, this discussion talks about the factors that influence slope stability. Interestingly, there's a focus on gravity. We don't talk about gravity when we are talking about the climate changing. However, here it indicates the main force responsible for mass movement is gravity. Gravity is the force that acts everywhere on the Earth's surface, pulling everything in a direction toward the center of the Earth. A magnetism dynamic. Something that is pulling and holding. It also indicates on a flat surface, flat surface, okay. On a flat surface, the force of gravity acts downward. So long as the material remains on the flat surface, it will not move under the force of gravity. And there's a little drawing to the right, and so you can see the indication there with respect to what this researcher is talking about in terms of slope stability. Now, the scientist goes on to talk about the role of water in slope stability or slope instability, because that, of course, would be the climate changing. The researcher indicates, although water is not always directly involved as the transporting medium in mass movement processes, it does play an important role. What role might that be? Water becomes important, according to this researcher, for several reasons. Number one, addition of water from rainfall or snow melt adds weight to the slope. Water can seep into the soil or rock and replace the air in the pore space or fractures. Since water is heavier than air, this increases the weight of the soil. And so the water increases the weight of the soil. Soil, according to this researcher, is also similar to or related to sand. Since water is heavier than air, this increases the weight of the soil. Weight is force, and force is stress divided by area. So the stress increases, and this can lead to slope instability. Water has the ability to change the angle. It indicates here, think about building a sand castle on the beach. If the sand is totally dry, it is impossible to build a pile of sand with a steep face like a castle wall. If the sand is somewhat wet, however, one can build a vertical wall. If the sand is too wet, then it flows like a fluid and cannot remain in position as a wall. And so water apparently is very important in terms of the creation of a slope, the destruction of a slope, the alteration of a slope. And so again, this is not talking about weather. However, weather appears to be able to influence climate. And so here we have another discussion coming from the Kentucky Department of Highways. And it's indicated here that water may cause unstable conditions in earth slopes due to changes in geometry. Water may cause unstable conditions in earth slopes. So water may cause unstable conditions in climate due to changes in geometry. Again, this is not generally what we are talking about when we are talking about climate changing. And often, interestingly, the focus on climate and changing is not about water causing climate and changing, but about how climate changing is impacting water. And so it seems like things are a bit in reverse, or at least a bit confusing. But what we do see here is that there is a conversation that is going on about climate and change that is not completely consistent with the general conversation that the general public appears to be having. And even those individuals who are appearing as learned on this topic, those individuals who have political leanings, perhaps. And so not only do you have these different conversations going on, but you have individuals who don't have a clue about what they are talking about. Clearly, that's becoming more clear. Those individuals feel like they understand what information, disinformation, and misinformation happens to be related to this very obscured topic of climate alteration. Now we're going to address some of the psychospiritual dynamics that are underlying some of the weather changes or weather alterations or these weird weather events. But what we see here is that when we are talking about weather, we are not necessarily talking about the same thing that other people might be talking about. And so this whole idea of climate remaining stable may very well be about some need that someone has for the earth itself to remain in a particular state, or for the earth to actually change from one state to another, or for that which is upon the earth to change or to remain static, or the dynamics related to gravity and the impact of gravity. Perhaps that's the real conversation that's going on, that magnetic conversation, that energy conversation, that very esoteric conversation that many of us are clearly not having. And what is also striking is the psychological underpinning, because the other understanding of climate is related to very human dynamics. And so when we are talking about climate staying the same or climate changing, we are talking about dynamics related to human beings. And so there appears to be some interest in human beings remaining constant or stable or not changing. The disposition of humans remaining in a particular way or changing. But that's the other piece that we are not talking about. But when we are talking about climate, part of what is going on is attempting to manipulate the climate of human beings in terms of cognitive and behavioral dynamics, the cognitive disposition, the attitude disposition, and the behavioral disposition of humans. And so it looks like this conversation about climate change needs to be broader. We perhaps need to open up the conversation so that we have all of the different types of climate that we might be addressing on the table. And so that we have clarity about what we are talking about when we are talking about climate, because slope and temperature and human disposition, those are not all synonymous. And finally, what's noteworthy about this is that one of the tactics of an individual that is practicing psychopathy is word salad. And so individuals, when they are practicing psychopathy, they often practice word games. And so part of the gaslighting dynamic involves word games or wordplay, so that individuals can say, that's not what I said, or that's not what I meant, or you said this, or you said that, when you really didn't say this, or you didn't really say that, or just general confusion about exactly what you are talking about. And so there is a thriving on that as a part of the manipulation dynamic. And so it's very difficult to see this in any other way at this point, because there is so much chaos. There is so much confusion about this whole dynamic of alteration in climate. And so it fits right in there with manipulation, the type of manipulation you see with word salad and individuals that are practicing psychopathy. And also what takes place with respect to psychopathy is when individuals have been duped by the individual practicing psychopathy, most of them, many of them, get delight in it. And so there's just the joy in other people being confused or deceived related to the manipulation. And so that's also a possibility here, that many individuals who are practicing psychopathy are getting great pleasure in individuals being duped by this dynamic of them talking about one thing and other people talking about something totally different, and about there being total confusion and chaos undergirding the entire conversation.